Improvising around the melody, and we've talked about improvising in the key of B flat major, just over the one quarter in the one key signature. The next thing you'll probably talk about in your jazz experience as you go through life is playing on the blues. And the blues is a 12-bar chord progression that basically uses 3 chords or 3 different harmonies throughout the duration of this 12-measure pattern. And so in order to step our way to understanding those, it's good to use the thing we know as our departure point, and that is this B flat major scale over here. And I've got labeled, of course, each scale degree, or each step, or each tone, the root of the scale, or scale degree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, along the way. So when we begin to play on the blues, a lot of times the first step that people use is to use a blanket scale, or one scale to cover all of the chords. A lot of times the scale that is chosen for that at first is what we actually call the blues scale. And so I've got the blues scale right here. It's got 1 fewer notes than our major scale, and it has a few alterations. It's still got our root, but the third, instead of being D natural, the third is lowered. Fourth is where it is. Then it adds a chromatic passing tone, so I've used the letter R, raised fourth. Still has our fifth, and then it has a lowered seventh, and finally the octave, the 8th step, or you could call it scale degree 1 again. That scale sounds like this. And so we can use that over a full chorus of blues, and I'll play that for you now. It works really well in some ways, but it does come with a couple of downsides as well. Here's what one chorus of blues sounds like with the blues scale. So there I used only those notes. I did go 1 past the octave. I put this D flat up in the next octave as well, just to give myself a little bit more range. And so that's a great way to get started, using one scale that works pretty well over the entire chorus of the blues. There are some other scales that a person might use. The B flat minor pentatonic down here, if you study it carefully, is only 1 note different than the blues scale. And that is to omit this note here, the raised fourth. Does not exist in the B flat minor pentatonic. So that's a pretty safe way to go. Works most of the time with a couple of, it's got a couple of downsides, but nothing too significant. And if you're willing to learn all 3 pentatonic scales, you can use the major pentatonic scale pretty well, but in that case you would want to be able to move from the B flat pentatonic to the pentatonic scales of the other chords that are in the blues, and we'll be talking about that right away. So those are some other options that you could circle around to. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the 3 chords, the 3 types of chords that we see very frequently in our early studies of jazz improvisation. Now, some vocabulary words. You'll hear people talk about what quality is a chord. They don't mean what quality is it like. Is it good quality or bad quality? In this setting, the word quality means what type of chord is it? Is it a major chord, like you see here? Is it a dominant chord, like we see here? Or is it a minor chord, like we see here? So the big word we use to describe those is quality. What is the chord quality? Is it major, dominant, or minor? And all of these symbols above the chords are the types of symbols that answer those questions for us. And when we talk about the different types of notation that we use, or symbols that we use to write these things out, the big $10 vocabulary word for that is nomenclature. And that just means all of the symbols that we use to distinguish notes and chords and scales, things like that. So it's good to understand what those symbols, or what the nomenclature, means. So I've got here a major chord, a dominant chord, and a minor chord. And the nomenclature that we would use to tell the player what each one is. So the first one, the major chord, it literally would have the root B flat, and then it tells us that the composer wants a major 7th chord. So that's what you would see if a composer wanted you to play a B flat major 7 chord. The root and the chord quality, major 7. Over here, we've still got the same root, B flat, but it doesn't say major 7, it just says 7. If you see a root followed by an odd number, 7 or larger, so like 7 or 9 or 11 or 13, that tells us that the composer wants a dominant chord. And we'll also come back here in just a second and talk about what notes make up these chords. But for the moment, we're just talking about the symbol or the nomenclature. So again, we've got a root and an odd number, 7 or larger. That's telling us that the quality that is desired is a dominant chord. And then over here, we've still got a root, B flat, and now it's got a lowercase m and a 7. A lowercase m means minor. And of course, the 7 still is asking for a 7th on the chord. And so this would be a B flat minor 7th chord. This is the symbol or the nomenclature to tell us that we want a minor 7th chord. The quality is minor 7th. So we can, of course, use any of these chord qualities, major, dominant, or minor, with any root. It could be C major 7, or F major 7, or E flat major 7. Same for all of these. Now, what we want, or what these chord qualities ask us to put in the chords, for a major 7th, it uses the root, B flat, the 3rd, which I've got labeled down here in the entire scale. The 3rd, D, is right there in the middle. The 5th is F, and the 7th from the major scale is A. So that chord consists of a B flat, D, F, and A. All notes selected from the major scale. And that's how we can remember that it forms a major 7th chord. All the notes come from the major scale. Moving over a chord, this one, B flat 7, tells us that we want a dominant 7th chord quality. And the only difference between dominant and major is that in the dominant, we lower the 7th scale degree. So whereas in this chord we had an A natural, now we want to lower it and we get an A flat. And that is what forms a B flat dominant 7th chord. A root, 3rd, 5th, and then a lowered 7th. So B flat, D, F, and the lowered 7th is A flat. And the 3rd chord quality that we see a lot in jazz is minor 7. So again, starting with our major chord and our major scale as our departing point, a minor 7th chord asks us to use a root, a lowered 3rd, so instead of D natural from our major, we flatted it. So now we have D flat as our 3rd. F is still in there, the 5th, and then a lowered 7th. So instead of A natural like we have in the major, we have A flat in the minor chord. So in our major chord, all the notes came from the major scale. In the dominant chord, we lowered just the 7th. And in our minor chord, we lowered our 3rd and our 7th. And those are the 3 chord qualities that we'll see most often, especially in the early days of learning jazz. So this dominant chord is the most important one that we need to know for playing the blues chord progression, which you will undoubtedly do a lot in your early days of playing jazz. And so when we have this dominant chord, we now know how to spell the chord using the root, 3rd, 5th, and lowered 7th. But oftentimes we might want to use the entire scale, not just the notes in the chord or the arpeggio. So just like we did with the chords, we can start with the idea of our major scale, like a B-flat major scale, and all we have to do to that to turn it into a dominant scale is to lower the 7th, just like on the chord that we did just moments ago. So we still have root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, lowered 7th, and 8, or 1, or the root. Here's the difference between the sound of a major scale and a dominant scale. First, major. And now, dominant, where we lower the 7th. If you had any trouble hearing that, go back and listen to that section again. And I played the 2 7ths a little bit longer so that you had a chance to hear what those sounded like. So that's how we form a dominant scale. And then knowing in the blues, we are going to want to use 3 of them. We're going to want to learn the one that's based on or rooted on B flat, and then on E flat, and here it is printed out, and on F. So again, each one is just like the major scale, except it has a lowered 7th. And those are going to be important building blocks as you learn to play the blues, because then you can use each scale as each chord goes by. And so that brings us to the actual form of B-flat blues. As I mentioned, it's a 12-measure form. And the 12 measures are generally broken up into 3 phrases that are 4 measures long. I've got each one printed here on each line. So the first phrase, 4 measures long, uses the harmony B-flat dominant 7th the whole time. The second phrase uses E-flat 7 for the first 2 measures of the phrase, and back to B-flat 7 to conclude the phrase. And then the third and final phrase in the blues uses an F7, and then often steps down to an E-flat dominant 7, and then back to our home base for this particular key, B-flat 7. And I've printed here the arpeggios that were based off of those chords that we looked at earlier. It's this one, the dominant 7th chord. And here I've printed it in arpeggio form so that we can practice those with our background track and get really good at knowing what those chord tones sound like along the way. So the next playing example and the next exercise you can play is to use these arpeggios to play along. And here it is with the background track. And so that was one time through the 12 measures, playing the arpeggios that go along with each chord. And once you master that, you can start working in the scales to each chord. you'll want to break those down into some smaller bite-sized pieces, trying to do the entire scale right off the bat and making each particular chord will be a bit of a big jump. So you might want to just start by, say, playing the first 3 notes around the blues. So I'll leave this viewing these chords up here, but instead of playing the arpeggios, I'm going to play the first 3 notes of each scale when that chord comes by. And this is just one step along our journey. And so as you gain confidence with each exercise along the way, then you can add more elements. So you could step up to playing the first 5 notes, and maybe instead of always going up, you could alternate, go up 1 measure and down the next. And I'm going to increase that to 1/8 notes. And eventually you can work to playing up and down the entire scale in 1/8 notes. I'll try up 1 measure and down the next, except for, of course, in this phrase here where I'll go up 1 scale and I'll see if I can concentrate enough to go down the next scale, which changes right in the midst of the exercise. And so that is up the scale, up and down the full scale in 1/8 notes. And I also should have said I went 1 past the octave to the 9th, just as another thing to add on to the complexity of the exercise. So once we know our chord types, and we know how to play the arpeggios, and we know how to play the scales, each scale that goes along with the chords, then, like we did that whole section of the video earlier, we can work on playing each scale in some patterns so that we start to gain some vocabulary. So instead of just straight up and down, we can start playing in patterns. Or and so on and so forth. The only limitation to those patterns we create is our own imagination and creativity. So you want to start with things that are doable and work your way up to more complex tasks, and not only learn that pattern in the 1 key, but also learn it in the other keys of the blues that we need. That'll give us the most flexibility to be able to improvise and change our notes selection along the way as the harmonies change. So I'll demonstrate 1 chorus of blues where I mix fairly freely between the arpeggios, the scales, trying to play some patterns, and even just kind of freely playing melodically along the way. So I'm trying to put together all the ingredients that we've covered so far. And so, believe it or not, everything I played in that chorus of the blues was directly from the exercises that we took, or an extension of that, in terms of playing scale notes, arpeggio notes, playing with the rhythm, and putting some neighboring tones in there that harkens all the way back to kind of just playing variations of the melody that we talked about earlier. And so the more ingredients you practice as just as single ingredients, like a little pattern in this key and a little pattern in that key, the more ready we become to put all of those ingredients together into creative solos. And so that is a brief exploration of the blues, the 12-bar form, the chord qualities that are used, the arpeggios and the scales, some blanket scales that we could use to improvise in the early days, and of course back to that nomenclature that we talked about, the different types of chords that we will see, although the blues that we talked about today used exclusively this chord quality. We will see a lot of major and minor chord qualities in addition to the dominant chords along the way. So I hope that gives you some ideas on how you can practice some of the ingredients that we use in improvisation. And remember, be sure to listen and find some of your own trombone heroes along the way. And if you hear something that you like from that player, challenge yourself, see if you can figure out what that player was actually playing. And it may turn out that that particular phrase that you liked might actually be in the key of one of the songs that you're working on as well. But if it isn't, you can always learn how to move it from the key that the professional player played into the key that you might need it for your song. And if that's a bit of a challenge for you, your teacher will be able to help you do that as well. So always ask lots of questions along the way, and hopefully this gives you enough tools to keep you fueled up for the whole school year, working on different exercises and gaining your vocabulary and your confidence in improvising on the trombone. Thanks for listening.